The words reached Lady Cordelia Pembroke through the partially open door of the Duke of Ashford's study like shards of glass, each syllable sharp enough to draw blood, precise enough to find the tender places she had not known were still vulnerable after 23 years of learning to expect very little from the world, and even less from the men who inhabited it. She had come downstairs at Ashford Manor seeking the Duke, her betrothed, though the word still felt strange and unearned in her mouth, to discuss some trivial matter regarding the wedding breakfast arrangement, a task her mother had assigned her with the nervous insistence of a woman who knew her daughter's match was too advantageous to risk through any social misstep, however minor. But she had paused in the corridor upon hearing masculine laughter from within the study, that particular quality of mirth that men employed when they believed themselves unobserved by feminine ears, when they felt free to speak truths they would otherwise conceal beneath the veneer of courtesy that society demanded. "Come now, Ashford," a voice she recognized as belonging to Lord Harrington, one of the Duke's gambling companions, drawled with the lazy amusement of a man who had drunk too much port and cared too little about consequences. "You cannot tell me you are genuinely pleased with this match. The girl is plain as weathered stone, with no conversation to recommend her, and a figure that suggests she has never declined a second helping of pudding. Surely there were more appealing options available, even with your financial difficulties." Cordelia's hand, which had been reaching for the door handle, froze in mid-air, her breath catching in her throat as she waited for Sebastian, the Duke, her intended husband, the man to whom she would pledge her life in just 3 days' time, to refute such cruel assessment, to defend her honour as any gentleman should defend his betrothed against such casual insult. She waited for outrage, for rebuke, for some sign that he valued her beyond the purely transactional nature of their arrangement, even though she knew, had always known, that their engagement had been founded on practical considerations rather than romantic sentiment, that her father's 40,000 dowry was the primary attraction rather than any quality she herself possessed. But Sebastian's response, when it came, carried no indignation, no defence, no suggestion that Lord Harrington's assessment had offended him in the slightest. Instead, his voice held only a weary resignation mixed with dark humour, the tone of a man acknowledging an unpleasant truth he could not deny. "You speak nothing but facts, Harrington," he said, and Cordelia heard the clink of glass against glass as he presumably refilled his drink. "The girl is indeed plain as old bread left too long on the shelf, with about as much charm and vivacity. Her conversation extends no further than watercolours and the weather, subjects that bore me to distraction within 5 minutes of exposure. And yes, her figure is decidedly matronly for a woman not yet 24, suggesting a fondness for cakes and pastries that will only worsen with age and childbearing." Each word landed like a physical blow, and Cordelia found herself gripping the doorframe for support, her knuckles white with the force of her grip, her entire body rigid with the effort required to remain silent and still when every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run back to her chamber and lock the door and never emerge, to escape this moment and the knowledge it carried about how the man she was to marry truly perceived her. But she remained frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from the disaster unfolding just beyond that partially open door, compelled by some masochistic impulse to hear every word, to understand the full extent of his contempt. "Then why proceed?" another voice interjected. "Sir William," she thought, though the roaring in her ears made it difficult to be certain. Surely you could find another heiress, one with beauty and charm to complement her fortune. Why shackle yourself to this particular girl when you clearly find her so unappealing? "Because I need £40,000, and I need it immediately," Sebastian replied, his voice hardening with the barely suppressed anger of a man forced to acknowledge his own desperation, his own reduced circumstance, his own failures. "My father's gambling debts alone total 35,000, not counting the mortgages he took against the estates or the loans he secured from every moneylender in London willing to advance funds to a duke, however profligate. I am drowning in obligations I did not create, but which I inherited along with the title. And Miss Pembroke's dowry represents my only lifeline, the only means by which I can save Ashford Manor and the tenant farms and everything my family has held for 6 generations. So yes, I will marry the plain, dull, plump girl with no charm or beauty to recommend her, and I will bed her dutifully until she produces the requisite heir, and I will endure her tedious conversation over breakfast for the rest of my days, because the alternative is debtor's prison and the complete destruction of everything my ancestors built. The silence that followed this pronouncement stretched and thickened until it became almost tangible, a physical presence in the air between Cordelia and the door through which these revelations had emerged. And in that silence, something inside her chest cracked and splintered. Not her heart precisely. She had been too practical, too aware of the transactional nature of aristocratic marriages to have invested her heart in this arrangement, but rather some fundamental assumption about her own worth, some basic belief that she possessed value beyond the monetary, that she was more than simply a repository of funds to be accessed and depleted according to masculine need. She had known, of course, that Sebastian's interest in her was primarily financial. She was not so naive as to imagine otherwise, not when he had shown no particular regard for her during their brief courtship, no sign that he found her company pleasant or her person attractive, conducting their interactions with the mechanical efficiency of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing a desired outcome. But knowing in the abstract that one's betrothed married for money was vastly different from hearing him describe her in such contemptuous terms to his drinking companions, from learning that he found her not merely unremarkable, but actively repellent, that he viewed their upcoming marriage not as a partnership or even a tolerable arrangement, but as a burden to be endured, a necessary sacrifice to salvage his wastrel father's legacy. Plain as old bread, no charm or vivacity, matronly figure. Tedious conversation. The words echoed in her mind, each repetition driving them deeper, carving them into her consciousness where they would remain forever, a permanent reminder of how the man to whom she would pledge her life, her body, her future, truly perceived her. And beneath the immediate pain of hearing such brutal assessment came a deeper realization, a recognition that clarified into perfect understanding with the force of revelation. She could not marry this man, could not bind herself to someone who held her in such contempt, could not spend the next 40 or 50 years knowing that her husband found her physically repellent and intellectually boring, that he resented her very existence even as he spent her money and used her body to produce his. Heirs. The marriage contract had been signed, yes, witnessed and sealed and legally binding, but Cordelia Pembroke was not without resources or intelligence, or the strength to refuse a fate that would diminish and degrade her for the remainder of her days. Her father might rage, society might gossip, the scandal might be tremendous, but surely anything was preferable to a lifetime of being tolerated at best and despised at worst by the man who was supposed to be her partner and protector. She straightened her spine, feeling something shift inside her chest, some fundamental transformation occurring in the space between one breath and the next. As if the woman who had approached this door a few minutes earlier, the obedient daughter, the grateful bride-to-be, the self-effacing girl who had accepted her plain face and unremarkable person as unchangeable facts, had died and been replaced by someone else entirely, someone harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. Then she raised her hand and pushed open the door with enough force that it swung wide and struck the interior wall with a satisfying crack that made all three men within the study jump and turn toward the sound with expressions of shock that might have been comical under different circumstances. Sebastian, the Duke of Ashford, she would not allow herself to think of him with any familiarity now, was halfway to his feet, his face draining of colour as he recognized her standing in the doorway, his aristocratic features arranging themselves into an expression of dawning horror that suggested he understood precisely how much she had overheard and comprehended the magnitude of his mistake. Lord Harrington and Sir William had frozen with their glasses raised, looking like guilty schoolboys caught in some transgression, their eyes darting between Cordelia and Sebastian as if seeking guidance on how to respond to this unprecedented situation. "Miss Pembroke?" Sebastian managed, his voice hoarse, his usual confidence entirely absent. "I did not realize you were... That is, I did not hear you approach." "Clearly," Cordelia interrupted, her voice cold and level, and entirely unlike the soft, deferential tones she had employed throughout their brief courtship, the accommodating manner she had adopted to make herself as inoffensive and agreeable as possible to this man, who had apparently found her offensive and disagreeable regardless of her efforts. You did not realize I was present, which allowed you to speak with the honesty you typically reserve for private masculine company, to share your genuine assessment of your betrothed, rather than maintaining the polite fiction that our upcoming marriage represents anything other than a financial transaction in which you are the reluctant purchaser and I am the undesirable but necessary commodity. She stepped fully into the room, pleased to see Sebastian flinch slightly at her words, at the hard edge in her voice that she had never before employed in his presence, had never known she possessed until this moment, when rage and humiliation had burned away all her careful restraint and revealed something sharper underneath. Plain as old bread, she continued, her tone conversational, despite the fury that burned beneath it. No charm or vivacity, a matronly figure that will only worsen with childbearing, tedious conversation that bores you to distraction. These are interesting observations, Your Grace, particularly since you have never once given me reason to believe you held me in such contempt, never once suggested through word or deed that you found my person so profoundly repellent. Cordelia, Miss Pembroke, I did not mean, Sebastian began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture, her hand slicing through the air between them. Do not compound your disrespect with dishonesty, she said, her voice dropping to something dangerously quiet. You meant every word. The port may have loosened your tongue, but it did not alter the substance of your opinions, which are clearly of long standing. You find me plain and dull and fat, and you resent the necessity of marrying me despite my £40,000, which you need to pay your wastrel father's gambling debts and save your precious estates from the consequences of ducal irresponsibility. She moved closer to where he stood, noting with satisfaction that he did not retreat, but neither did he advance, frozen in place by what appeared to be equal parts shame and apprehension. When she stood directly before him, close enough to see the fine lines of dissipation around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he had already consumed more than was wise this afternoon, she drew back her hand and struck him across the face with enough force that the crack of her palm against his cheek echoed through the study like a gunshot, the sound sharp and clean and deeply satisfying. That, she said, into the stunned silence that followed, is for your disrespect, for speaking of me as if I were livestock to be assessed and found wanting, for reducing me to a collection of physical defects and monetary value, for making me believe that you at least regarded me with neutral tolerance when in fact you held me in active contempt, though, Sebastian raised his hand to his reddening cheek, staring at her with an expression of complete shock, as if she had transformed into some mythical creature before his eyes, something dangerous and unpredictable, where he had expected only meek compliance. The engagement has ended, Cordelia continued, pleased to hear that her voice remained steady despite the rage that threatened to choke her. I will not marry a man who finds me repellent, who views our marriage as a burden to be endured rather than a partnership to be valued. You may inform my father, Your Grace, and accept whatever social consequences follow from a broken engagement. I care nothing for scandal, if it means I am spared a lifetime of your resentful tolerance. She turned to leave, her point made, and her dignity as intact as she could manage under the circumstances, but Sebastian's voice stopped her before she reached the door. The contract is binding, he said, and there was something in his tone that made her pause, despite her desire to quit his presence immediately and permanently. Your father and I signed the marriage settlements 3 weeks ago, witnessed by both our solicitors and legally enforceable in any court in England. You cannot simply dissolve an engagement because you overheard comments you were never meant to hear, comments spoken in private among gentlemen. Cordelia turned slowly, her heart sinking even as her mind raced to process this new information, to understand what it meant for her planned escape from this disastrous marriage. The contract is binding, she repeated, her voice hollow. Meaning, I have no legal recourse, no means by which to refuse this marriage without bringing scandal and financial liability upon my entire family. I am sorry, Sebastian said, and there was genuine regret in his voice, though it did nothing to soften the blow of his confirmation. But yes, that is precisely what it. The settlements were intentionally structured to prevent either party from withdrawing without substantial financial penalties, protections your father insisted upon to ensure that my need for your dowry would not evaporate once the funds were secured. You are bound to marry me, Cordelia, and I am bound to marry you, regardless of what either of us might wish under different circumstances. The room spun slightly as the full implications settled over her, that she was trapped, that all her righteous fury and dramatic gestures meant nothing in the face of legal contracts and family honor, that in 3 days' time she would stand before a priest and pledge herself to a man who had just described her in terms that would have been insulting if applied to livestock. She felt something dangerous coiling in her chest, something that combined rage and humiliation, and a cold, calculating awareness of her own limited but not non-existent power in this situation. "Very well," she heard herself say, the words emerging in a voice that sounded nothing like her own, hard and flat, and utterly devoid of the warmth or softness that had characterized all her previous interactions with Sebastian. "If the contract is binding, then we shall proceed as planned. The wedding will occur as scheduled, but I suggest you understand something before you arrive at the church, something that may clarify the nature of the marriage you are about to enter." She walked back toward him with slow, deliberate steps, watching his expression shift from relief to uncertainty as she approached. And when she stood close enough that he would hear every word with perfect clarity, she spoke in tones of absolute conviction. "You spoke truly when you said you need my £40,000, when you acknowledged that my dowry represents your only salvation from debtor's prison and estate foreclosure. What you apparently failed to consider is that this need gives me power, Your Grace, substantial power over the course and conduct of our marriage. You may find me plain and dull and fat. You may resent the necessity of wedding me, but you need my money desperately enough that you are willing to overlook your personal distaste for my person, which means, in practical terms, that I control the very thing you value most in our arrangement." She bent down and retrieved the betrothal ring from where it had fallen during their confrontation, an elaborate ruby surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother, a ring she had worn with pride for the past 3 weeks, believing it symbolized at least mutual respect, if not affection. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, turning it so the stones caught the light, then reached for Sebastian's hand and placed the ring firmly in his palm, closing his fingers around it with deliberate care. "You will marry me in 3 days," she continued, her eyes holding his with unflinching directness, "and you will receive your £40,000, and you will save your estates and pay your father's debts and salvage what remains of the Ashford legacy. But understand this, Your Grace, you are not marrying the meek, grateful girl who accepted your proposal with such pathetic eagerness 3 months ago. You are marrying a woman who now understands exactly what you think of her, who knows precisely how much contempt you hold for her person and character, and who has decided that if she must endure a loveless marriage of financial convenience, she will at least ensure that the burden falls equally upon both parties." She leaned closer, dropping her voice to something barely above a whisper, intimate and threatening in equal measure. "You called me plain as old bread, Your Grace. You mocked my figure and my conversation and my entire existence as if I were some unfortunate obligation, rather than a human being worthy of basic respect. Well, I promise you this. When you stand beside me at the altar and pledge your vows, you will not be marrying bread. You will be marrying a lioness, Sebastian. And lions do not forget injuries, do not forgive casual cruelty, do not permit themselves to be diminished or degraded without exacting a price for such treatment. You wanted my £40,000 badly enough to overlook my physical and intellectual defects. I hope the money proves worth what it will cost you, because I intend to give you exactly the wife you deserve. And I suspect that by the time I am finished educating you in the consequences of your contempt, you will wish you had chosen debtor's prison instead." Then she turned and walked from the study with her head high and her spine straight, leaving Sebastian standing frozen with the ring clutched in his hand, and an expression on his face that suggested he had just glimpsed something in her that he had never suspected existed, something that had been lurking beneath her compliant exterior all along, waiting only for the right provocation to emerge into the light and reveal itself as infinitely more formidable than the plain, dull girl he had so casually dismissed. The wedding took place 3 days later in the ancient chapel at Ashford Manor, the ceremony attended by 200 guests, representing the highest echelons of English society, all of whom had come to witness the marriage of the Duke of Ashford to the unremarkable Miss Pembroke, that plain heiress whose substantial dowry had somehow convinced one of England's most eligible bachelors to overlook her numerous defects in favour of financial salvation. Cordelia had spent the intervening days in a state of cold, focused preparation, transforming herself with the assistance of London's finest modiste and most exclusive hairdresser into something that bore little resemblance to the soft, self-effacing girl who had accepted Sebastian's proposal 3 months earlier with such grateful disbelief. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, cut to emphasize rather than conceal her figure, which was, she had discovered through proper corseting and expert tailoring, rather more attractive than she had believed when viewing it through the lens of self-criticism that society encouraged in women who did not conform to conventional standards of ethereal slenderness. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that framed her face and softened features she had always considered too severe, too angular, too far from the delicate prettiness that men supposedly preferred. And her face itself had been subtly enhanced with cosmetics applied with such skill that they appeared entirely natural, bringing colour to her cheeks and definition to her eyes, and a fullness to her lips that transformed her from plain to striking, from forgettable to arresting. When she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she had the satisfaction of watching Sebastian's face drain of colour, and then flush dark with what might have been shock or appreciation, or possibly both, his pale blue eyes widening as he took in her transformed appearance, with an expression that suggested he had expected the plain girl in her usual modest dress and simple hairstyle, not this elegant woman who moved with confidence and carried herself with the bearing of someone who knew her own worth, regardless of masculine opinion. She saw confusion flicker across his features, saw him reassess what he thought he knew about her, saw the first hint of uncertainty enter his eyes as he began to understand that perhaps she had not been plain so much as deliberately understated, hiding her potential beneath layers of self-effacement that were entirely unnecessary once she decided to stop apologizing for her existence. The vows were spoken with perfect formality, each word articulated clearly and without tremor despite the rage that still burned beneath Cordelia's composed exterior, the fury that 3 days had not diminished but rather focused and refined into something colder and infinitely more purposeful than mere emotional reaction. When Sebastian placed the ring on her finger, that same ruby and diamond betrothal ring she had returned to him 3 days earlier, she met his eyes with an expression that communicated nothing of her thoughts, maintaining the pleasant neutrality expected of a bride, while internally cataloguing every detail of this moment, storing it away for future reference when she would need to remember why she had chosen this particular course of action. "I promise to be the wife you deserve," she said during her personal vows, the words she had added to the traditional ceremony over the vicar's mild objections about unconventional additions to sacred liturgy, and she saw Sebastian's jaw tighten slightly as he recognized the deliberate echo of her threat from 3 days prior, understood that she was publicly committing to the vengeance she had promised in his study, but he could do nothing except smile and nod as if her vow had been conventional and sweet rather than ominous, and could offer no objection to words that sounded innocuous to everyone else in attendance, but which both of them knew carried a very different meaning. The wedding breakfast that followed was a lavish affair featuring 20 courses and the finest wines from the Ashford cellars, the kind of extravagant display that Sebastian could ill afford, but which ducal pride demanded regardless of financial reality. Cordelia presided over the celebration with perfect grace, accepting congratulations from guests who remarked on how well she looked, how the marriage seemed to suit her already, how fortunate Sebastian was to have secured such a substantial dowry, along with a bride who cleaned up rather better than anyone had expected. She smiled and thanked them and played the role of blushing bride with consummate skill, all while carefully implementing the first phase of her strategy. She had positioned herself beside the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, Sebastian's mother, a formidable woman of 60 who had been relegated to the dower house after her husband's death, but who still wielded considerable social influence and whose good opinion mattered enormously in aristocratic circles. Throughout the breakfast, Cordelia engaged the dowager in intimate conversation, lamenting with careful subtlety how she had hoped Sebastian might take more interest in the estate management given the challenges facing the properties, how she had suggested they might review the household accounts together, but he had seemed entirely disinterested in such mundane matters, preferring to spend his time with his gambling companion rather than attending to the responsibilities his position demanded. "I know it is not my place to criticize," Cordelia said with perfectly calibrated concern, her voice pitched just loud enough that several nearby guests could overhear without it being obvious she intended them to hear. But I had thought that marriage might encourage Sebastian to adopt a more serious approach to his duties, to perhaps curtail some of the more frivolous activities that consumed his bachelor days. I worry that the estates will continue to decline if someone does not attend to them properly, and I should hate to see such a proud legacy diminished through neglect, particularly when there are tenants and staff who depend upon proper management for their livelihood. Wow. The dowager's expression had grown progressively darker throughout this speech, her lips pressing into a thin line of disapproval as she absorbed Cordelia's carefully constructed portrait of her son as a lazy, irresponsible duke, more interested in pleasure than duty. "I was not aware that Sebastian continued his gambling despite his marriage," she said coldly, her voice carrying that aristocratic hauteur that could freeze blood at 20 paces. "I had assumed that taking a wife would inspire him to more appropriate conduct, particularly given the substantial dowry you have brought to the marriage, funds that should certainly be sufficient to address any outstanding obligations and allow him to focus on his proper responsibilities." "Oh, he has paid some of the debts," Cordelia assured her, infusing her voice with the kind of loyal defensiveness that actually made the criticism more damning. "And I am certain he intends to become more focused once we are settled. It is merely that old habits die hard, and the gentlemen he associates with do seem to encourage behaviors that perhaps are less appropriate for a married man than they were for a bachelor. But I am confident he will improve with time and proper guidance, and I intend to support him in every way possible as he grows into his role as duke and husband." The damage was done, planted with such perfect subtlety that the dowager would believe she had reached her own conclusions rather than having them fed to her through careful manipulation. By the end of the breakfast, Cordelia had managed to convey to Sebastian's mother and at least a dozen influential guests that her new husband was lazy, irresponsible, more interested in gambling than duty, and generally failing to live up to the standards expected of his position, all while maintaining the appearance of a loyal wife defending her husband's minor flaws, making the criticisms infinitely more effective than if she had launched direct attacks. She watched Sebastian across the room, saw him laughing with Lord Harrington and Sir William, saw him drain another glass of champagne despite the early hour, and she felt nothing but cold satisfaction at how well her first salvo had landed, how effectively she had begun the process of stripping away his social standing and public reputation. He thought he had married plain bread, tedious conversation, a matronly figure he would have to tolerate in exchange for £40,000. He was about to discover that he had married a strategist, someone who understood that power in aristocratic society came not from money or title, but from reputation and social capital, both of which she intended to systematically destroy until he understood what it felt like to be diminished, to be mocked, to be found perpetually wanting by the person whose opinion should matter most. The first month of marriage passed in a carefully orchestrated campaign that Cordelia executed with the precision of a military general, each move calculated to maximum effect, each strike designed to weaken Sebastian's position while strengthening her own, until the balance of power in their marriage had shifted so dramatically that he found himself essentially helpless, dependent upon her goodwill for everything from money to social standing to basic comfort within his own home. She began with the household staff, whom she won over with the simple expedient of treating them as human beings worthy of respect and fair compensation, something Sebastian had apparently never considered during his tenure as Duke. She raised wages across the board, funding the increases from her own quarterly allowance rather than the estate accounts, making it clear that the improvements to staff welfare came from her personal generosity rather than ducal obligation. She learned their names and the names of their children, inquired after their health and their concerns, instituted more reasonable working hours and better living conditions in the servants' quarters. Within 2 weeks, the entire household staff viewed her as a benevolent saviour, and Sebastian as the neglectful master who had underpaid and overworked them for years, their loyalty transferring wholesale from Duke to Duchess until he found himself essentially an outsider in his own home, served with cold correctness rather than genuine regard, his requests met with minimal compliance while hers were executed with enthusiastic efficiency. The transformation in household dynamics became brutally apparent one evening when Sebastian rang for his valet and received no response for 20 minutes, finally emerging from his chamber to find the man deep in conversation with Cordelia, about some minor matter regarding the arrangement of the linen closets. When you are quite finished, Sebastian said with barely suppressed irritation, I require assistance with my evening attire, Barnes, if you can spare the time from your consultation with the Duchess. Barnes had glanced at Cordelia, received a subtle nod of permission, then turned back to Sebastian with an expression of polite indifference that suggested the Duke's needs ranked substantially below the Duchess's preferences. Of course, Your Grace, he said without any particular deference. I shall attend you momentarily, once Her Grace and I have concluded our discussion of household matters. The message was unmistakable. The staff now answered to Cordelia first, and Sebastian second. His authority in his own home subordinated to hers through the simple expedient of treating servants well and earning their genuine loyalty rather than demanding their service through right of position. Sebastian had stared at her across the corridor with dawning comprehension of what she had accomplished, how thoroughly she had undermined his standing with the people who managed every aspect of daily life at Ashford Manor. But he could hardly object without appearing churlish. What argument could he make against his wife treating the staff with kindness and respect? Simultaneously with her campaign to win the household, Cordelia launched her assault on Sebastian's financial independence, a campaign that began with a thorough investigation of the estate accounts and Sebastian's personal expenditures over the past 5 years. She had hired her father's solicitor to conduct the review, discovering with grim satisfaction that Sebastian's situation was even more desperate than he had revealed during that overheard conversation in his study. The gambling debts and loans totaled not £35,000 but closer to 50, with creditors scattered across London and several other cities, some of them disreputable moneylenders who charged usurious interest rates and employed violent collection methods when payments fell behind. She assembled all the documentation into neat files organized by creditor and amount, then requested Sebastian's presence in the estate office for a discussion of household finances, a request he could not refuse, without appearing to abdicate his responsibilities entirely, though she could see the reluctance in his face when he arrived to find her seated behind the desk that had belonged to Ashford Dukes for generations, the physical positioning making clear that she had claimed this territory as her own. I have completed my review of the estate finance, she said without preamble, watching his face carefully for reactions she could catalogue and exploit, and I confess I am shocked at the extent of the obligations you neglected to mention when you were so desperate for my dowry. £50,000 in total debt, Sebastian, not the 35 you admitted to your drinking companion. 15,000 owed to Lord Harrington at 18% interest, 8,000 to Sir William with quarterly compounding, 12,000 to a Mr. Wickham whose business practices suggest he is not above employing physical violence to secure repayment, and another 15,000 spread across various moneylenders and gambling establishments throughout London. She paused, allowing the full weight of these numbers to settle over him, watching his jaw tighten and his hands clench into fists at his sides as he absorbed her knowledge of the complete extent of his financial catastrophe. Your father's legacy is even worse than you suggested, she continued, her voice cool and professional, maintaining the tone of someone discussing business rather than personal failure. The estates are mortgaged to 60% of their value. The tenant farms are in desperate need of investment that has not been forthcoming for at least a decade, and the London house is one missed payment away from foreclosure. In short, Your Grace, you are not merely in financial difficulty, you are facing complete and total ruin, the kind of collapse that will see you in debtor's prison and your family name destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Sebastian had remained silent throughout her recitation, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet her gaze as she laid out the full scope of his failures with merciless precision. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with what might have been shame or anger, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying unbearable weight for too long. And I suppose you are about to tell me that you will withhold the dowry funds, he said bitterly. That despite the marriage contract and the legal transfer of your £40,000, you have somehow found a means to prevent me from accessing the money, leaving me exactly where I was before this marriage, except now burdened with a wife who clearly despises me as much as I... He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize where that sentence was leading. As much as you despise me, Cordelia finished for him, her voice sharp. Yes, Sebastian, I am aware that you find me plain and dull and fat, that you resent having to marry me despite my substantial dowry, that you view our marriage as a burden you must endure rather than a partnership you value. You made your feelings perfectly clear in your study 3 weeks ago, and I have not forgotten a single word of that charming conversation." She stood and moved around the desk, coming to stand directly before him, close enough that he would have to work to avoid her gaze. "But no, I'm not withholding the dowry funds, because that would be illegal and would subject my father to financial penalties he does not deserve. The £40,000 has been properly transferred and is legally yours to deploy as you see fit. However, what you apparently failed to consider in your rush to secure my money is that I also control substantial additional funds, my quarterly allowances, my personal investments, my mother's settlement that comes to me independent of my marriage, and that these funds might prove essential to covering the difference between what you receive from my dowry and what you actually owe." She let that sink in, watched his expression shift from defensiveness to understanding to something approaching fear as he grasped the implications of what she was saying. "Your debts total £50,000, she continued, keeping her voice level and businesslike. "My dowry provides £40,000, which leaves a gap of £10,000 that you have no means of covering through estate income or asset sales, not without destroying the properties entirely and eliminating any possibility of future revenue generation. That £10,000 is the difference between partial relief and complete salvation, between reducing your debt burden and eliminating it entirely, between maintaining some creditors' patience and facing immediate legal action from those you cannot fully satisfy." She walked to the window, looking out over the estate grounds that Sebastian had inherited along with his impossible debts, the lands that 6 generations of Ashfords had held and which now teetered on the edge of loss through ducal irresponsibility and aristocratic excess. "I am willing to provide those additional funds," she said quietly, not looking at, keeping her gaze fixed on the formal gardens below. "I am willing to pay every last penny of your father's debts and your own gambling obligations, to clear the mortgages and restore the estates to solvency, to ensure that the Ashford legacy survives intact for your heirs and their heirs after them. But I will not do so unconditionally, Sebastian. I will not hand over £10,000 of my personal money, money that is mine legally and independently, simply to bail you out of consequences you richly deserve, particularly not when you hold me in such obvious contempt." She turned back to face him, her expression cold and implacable. "So here are my terms, Your Grace, terms that are entirely non-negotiable and which you will accept immediately if you wish to receive my assistance. First, you will cease all gambling immediately and permanently. I will not finance continued irresponsibility, and if I discover you have wagered so much as a shilling after today, the offer of additional funds is withdrawn, and you may face your creditors with only the £40,000 from my dowry to protect you. Second, you will attend estate business daily, meeting with stewards and reviewing accounts, and making yourself actually useful rather than treating the duchy as an irrelevant burden. Third, you will limit your alcohol consumption to dinner and social occasions. No more afternoon drinking sessions in your study with disreputable companions who encourage your worst tendencies." She moved closer, lowering her voice to something more intimate and infinitely more threatening. "And fourth, most importantly, you will end all contact with your mistresses, both the opera singer you maintain in rooms near Covent Garden and the widow you visit on Tuesday afternoons in Mayfair. I will not be humiliated by a husband who keeps women while married to me, and I will not pretend not to notice your infidelities simply because aristocratic wives are expected to endure such treatment gracefully. You will be faithful to me, Sebastian, or you will be bankrupt. Those are your options. Choose quickly." His face had gone from pale to flushed to pale again during her recitation of terms, shock and anger and humiliation chasing each other across his features as he absorbed the full extent of her knowledge and the absolute control she was asserting over his conduct. "You have been spying on me," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage, "investigating my private affairs, cataloguing my movements, treating me like a criminal rather than your husband." "You called me plain as old bread," Cordelia replied, her voice cutting through his indignation with surgical precision. "You mocked my figure and my conversation, and expressed resentment at the necessity of marrying me despite desperately needing my money. You have shown me absolutely no respect, no regard, no basic courtesy that any woman deserves from her husband, And you now object that I have taken steps to understand the full scope of the man to whom I am legally bound for life. You objected to my investigation of your character and conduct. How dare you demand from me the consideration you have so spectacularly failed to extend to me? The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by their breathing and the distant sounds of the household going about its business beyond the closed office doors. And in that silence something in Sebastian seemed to crack, his shoulders sagging and his head dropping, as if he could no longer maintain the weight of his defences against her assault. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have investigated every corner of my life, learned every failure and weakness, positioned yourself to control everything from my finances to my daily conduct. You have made me dependent on your goodwill for salvation, from debts I cannot pay and obligations I cannot meet. You have won, Cordelia. You hold all the power in this marriage, all the control, all the leverage. So tell me, what exactly do you want from me beyond my complete and utter capitulation to your demands?" She studied him for a long moment, this man who had described her with such contempt, who had viewed their marriage as a burden to be endured, who had planned to use her money and ignore her person, while maintaining his previous life essentially unchanged. He looked diminished now, smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogant confidence that had characterized all their previous interactions, and she felt a cold satisfaction at how thoroughly she had dismantled his power and exposed his vulnerabilities. "I want you to understand," she said finally, her voice soft but implacable, "what it feels like to be powerless, to be dependent on someone else's mercy, to know that everything you value hangs on the goodwill of another person who has every reason to deny you what you need. I want you to learn what I have always known as a woman in this world, that survival sometimes requires accepting conditions you would never freely choose, that pride is a luxury available only to those with power and options, that sometimes the only path forward requires swallowing your dignity and accepting help from sources you resent." She stepped back, creating physical distance between them, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the finality of judgment rendered. "You will accept my terms, Sebastian, because you have no choice. You will stop gambling and drinking and keeping mistresses. You will attend to your estates and your responsibilities, and you will treat me with the basic respect I deserve as your wife and the woman whose money is saving you from complete disaster. And perhaps, if you learn your lessons well, if you demonstrate genuine change rather than mere compliance born of desperation, I might someday consider softening my stance and allowing our marriage to be something more than the transaction you clearly intended it to be. But that day is a long way off, your grace, and you have a great deal to prove before I trust that your reformation is anything more than temporary convenience." She moved toward the door, her business concluded and her terms stated, but paused with her hand on the handle to deliver one final observation. "Oh, and Sebastian, you should know that I am 6 weeks pregnant. The child was conceived on our wedding night, which means you are permanently bound to me, not just through legal contract, through parentage of your heir. You wanted my £40,000 badly enough to marry a woman you found repellent. I hope you find the complete package worth what it is costing you, because there is no escape now, no divorce or annulment or any other means by which you can extricate yourself from this marriage. You are mine, Sebastian, as completely as law and biology can make you, and I suggest you become accustomed to that reality quickly." Then she left him standing alone in the office, with the files documenting his failures spread across the desk and the full weight of his powerlessness settling over him like a physical burden, and she felt nothing but cold triumph at how perfectly she had executed her revenge, how thoroughly she had turned the tables on the man who had planned to use her and discard her emotional needs in pursuit of his own financial salvation. 3 months into their marriage, Sebastian had been reduced to a shadow of the arrogant duke who had mocked her as plain bread, and Cordelia had achieved everything she set out to accomplish when she promised him an education in consequence. He had complied with every term she demanded, ceasing all gambling and drinking beyond dinner, attending to estate business with a diligence that impressed even the stewards who had despaired of his inattention for years, and ending all contact with his former mistresses in favour of faithful adherence to his marriage vow. The household ran smoothly under her management, the debts had been systematically paid down to manageable levels, and the estates showed signs of recovery from decades of neglect. But the cost of his transformation had been steep, exacted from his pride and his spirit, and his fundamental sense of himself as someone who controlled his own destiny rather than dancing to someone else's tune. He had grown thin and quiet, speaking only when necessary, moving through the house like a ghost of his former self, all his previous confidence and aristocratic assurance stripped away by months of systematic diminishment and the constant awareness that everything he valued depended entirely on Cordelia's continued willingness to support him financially and socially. She watched this transformation with complex emotions she did not care to examine too closely. Satisfaction at his downfall certainly, vindication that he understood now what he had made her feel when she overheard his contemptuous description, but also something that might have been concern or possibly regret, a sense that perhaps she had wielded her power more harshly than strictly necessary, that in her determination to make him suffer, she had perhaps gone further than pure justice demanded. These uncomfortable thoughts intensified when Sebastian fell seriously ill in the 4th month of their marriage, succumbing to a fever that raged through his body with terrifying intensity, leaving him delirious and barely conscious for 3 days while the doctor prescribed treatments that seemed to have no effect beyond allowing the illness to run its course. Cordelia found herself keeping vigil at his bedside, despite her determination to maintain emotional distance, cooling his fevered skin with damp cloths and coaxing medicine past his lips during the brief moments of semi-consciousness when he could swallow without choking. On the 3rd night of his illness, when the fever was at its worst and the doctor had warned her to prepare for the possibility that Sebastian might not survive until morning, he opened his eyes with unexpected clarity and looked at her with recognition that had been absent during his delirium. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice raw from fever and disuse. "I did not expect you to stay, not after everything I said, everything I did. You would have been well within your rights to let the servants manage my care and remain at a safe distance until the outcome was determined." Cordelia pressed another cool cloth to his forehead, not meeting his eyes, uncomfortable with this moment of vulnerability and the emotions it stirred in her carefully maintained defenses. "You are my husband," she said quietly. "Whatever our differences, whatever anger I hold toward you for your contempt and your cruelty, I do not wish you dead, Sebastian. I wanted you humbled, yes, wanted you to understand what powerlessness feels like, wanted you to recognize the harm you caused with your casual dismissal of my worth. But I never wanted you destroyed, never wanted to break you entirely, only to teach you consequences and boundaries and the necessity of treating others with the respect you demand for yourself." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of realization that suggested the fever had burned away some of his remaining defenses against uncomfortable truths. "You could have hated me," he said slowly, working through thoughts that seemed to cost him enormous effort in his weakened state. "You had every reason to hate me after what you overheard, every justification for making our marriage a living hell beyond even what you actually implemented. But you did not, did you? You never actually hated me. You were teaching me systematically and ruthlessly, but you were teaching rather than simply punishing, trying to force me to become better rather than simply making me suffer for being worse." Cordelia felt something crack in her chest at his words, a fissure opening in the ice she had carefully maintained around her heart for 3 months of calculated revenge. "I did not hate you," she admitted, the confession emerging despite her intention to maintain her distance, to preserve the dynamic she had so carefully constructed. "I was hurt by what you said, humiliated by the contempt in your voice when you described me to your friends, angry that you viewed our marriage as such a burden. But underneath the hurt and anger, I remembered the man I observed during our courtship, the moments when you showed unexpected kindness to servants or concern for tenant welfare, the glimpses of someone better than the dissolute gambler you had become under your father's terrible influence." She set aside the cloth and took his hand, feeling the heat of his fever through his skin, his fingers closing weakly around hers. "I wanted that better man to emerge," she continued, her voice soft and uncertain, in a way it had not been since their wedding day. "I wanted to shock you out of your casual cruelty and force you to examine the path you were following, the man you were becoming under the weight of your father's legacy and your own poor choices. So yes, I was harsh, deliberately and systematically harsh, stripping away your power and your confidence and everything you used to avoid confronting your own failures. I made you powerless because I needed you to understand what that felt like. needed you to grasp viscerally what you were imposing on me when you planned to take my money and use my body and ignore my heart as if I were merely a convenient solution to your financial problems. I understand now, Sebastian said, tears tracking down his fever-flushed cheeks, his voice breaking with emotion too strong to contain. God help me, Cordelia. I understand what I did to you, how cruel I was, how unforgivably dismissive of your worth and your feelings and your right to be treated as a full human being rather than a financial convenience. I understand why you had to break me down, had to strip away everything I used to avoid facing my own cruelty and selfishness. And I am so deeply, profoundly sorry for every word I spoke that day in my study, for every thought I held about you that suggested you were somehow less worthy of love and respect, simply because you did not conform to conventional standards of beauty, or because I had the arrogance to judge your worth based on superficial characteristics rather than genuine character. He struggled to sit up slightly, his grip on her hand tightening despite his weakness, his eyes holding hers with desperate intensity. I was wrong, he continued, the words tumbling out as if he feared he might not have another opportunity to speak them, as if the fever might take him before he could properly confess and seek absolution. I was so deeply, inexcusably wrong about you, about what mattered in a marriage, about what truly makes a person worthy of love and admiration. You are not plain, Cordelia. You are striking and elegant, and far more beautiful than I had eyes to see when I was blinded by my own shallow preferences and society's narrow definitions. You are not dull. You are intelligent and strategic, and infinitely more interesting than the vapid beauties I thought I preferred before I had sense enough to recognize genuine quality. And you are not some burden I must endure, but rather a gift I never deserved, and which I am terrified I have squandered beyond any possibility of redemption through my own cruel stupidity. Cordelia felt her own tears beginning to fall, her carefully maintained control crumbling under the assault of his confession, the genuine remorse in his voice breaking through all her protective barriers. I forgive you, she heard herself whisper, the words emerging without conscious decision, bypassing all her rational objections to speak the truth her heart had perhaps always known, even while her mind pursued revenge. I forgive you, Sebastian, though you must also forgive yourself, must stop carrying the weight of your father's failures and your own past mistakes, as if they define who you are permitted to become. You are not your father, not the man who gambled away his legacy and left you drowning in debts you did not create. You are capable of being better, of building something worth preserving, of loving and being loved in return, if you can only believe yourself worthy of such grace. He pulled her closer, despite his weakness, until she was half lying across the bed beside him, and she felt his lips press against her forehead in a kiss that communicated more than words could adequately convey. Gratitude and relief, and the tentative beginning of something that might, given time and continued effort, develop into genuine affection, or possibly even love. Help me be better, he whispered against her hair. Help me become the man you glimpsed beneath my failures, the man who might actually deserve someone as remarkable as you have proven yourself to be. I know I have no right to ask for your help after everything I have done, but I am asking anyway, begging really, because I cannot do this alone, and you are the only person who has ever cared enough to force me to confront my own worst tendencies, rather than simply enabling them or walking away in disgust. I will help you, she promised, settling against his side and letting herself relax into his embrace for the first time since their wedding night, allowing the possibility that their marriage might become something real and valuable rather than merely transactional. But you must understand that the help will not always be gentle, that sometimes love requires harsh truths and difficult lessons rather than comfortable enabling. I will not become the kind of wife who overlooks your failures or excuses your weaknesses simply to maintain peace or preserve my own comfort. If you want me as your partner, Sebastian, you must accept that I will hold you accountable and will expect you to live up to your potential rather than settling for the diminished version of yourself that is easier but ultimately empty. I would not want anything less, he assured her, his arms tightening around her despite his weakened state. I have had enough people who told me what I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to know. Enough companions who encouraged my worst impulses because it served their interests or entertained their boredom. I want a wife who will challenge me, who will refuse to accept less than my best effort, who will love me enough to risk my anger or disappointment by speaking uncomfortable truths that ultimately make me better. You have already proven yourself to be exactly that kind of woman, called fierce and uncompromising and absolutely committed to refusing comfortable lies in favor of difficult growth. And I find that I am grateful beyond words that you were strong enough to fight for the possibility of our marriage becoming something real, rather than simply accepting the hollow transaction I had intended. They lay together in the quiet darkness while his fever gradually subsided and the immediate crisis passed, and Cordelia felt the last of her ice melting away, the protective barriers she had erected 3 months earlier dissolving in the warmth of his genuine remorse and her own capacity for forgiveness. She had achieved her revenge, had made him understand powerlessness and consequence, and the necessity of respecting those you might otherwise dismiss. But she had also discovered something unexpected in the process, that beneath her anger and hurt had always been the capacity to love this flawed man if he could only prove himself worthy of such gift, and that perhaps his journey through humiliation and illness had transformed him into someone who might actually deserve the second chance she found herself willing to offer. The crisis came 2 weeks later, sudden and terrifying and utterly unexpected, despite Cordelia's awareness that pregnancy always carried risks, particularly for a woman bearing her first child, in an era when medical knowledge remained limited, and maternal mortality statistics were grim enough to give any expectant mother pause. She had been feeling unwell for several days, experiencing cramping and fatigue beyond what seemed normal for someone in her 4th month, but she had attributed the discomfort to the stress of recent weeks and the emotional turbulence of her relationship with Sebastian, rather than any genuine medical concern. Then one morning, she woke to find blood staining her nightdress and bedsheets. Far too much blood for anything but serious complications, and the cramping intensified into something that felt like her body trying to tear itself apart from the inside. She called for Sebastian, with a voice made weak by pain and fear, and he came running from his adjacent chamber where he had been dressing, his face draining of colour, when he saw the blood and understood immediately what it meant. "Get Dr. Whitley," she managed through clenched teeth, trying to breathe through the contractions that should not be happening for at least 5 more months, trying to stay calm despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. "Something is wrong, Sebastian. The baby. I think I am losing the baby." He had run from the room shouting for servants to fetch the doctor immediately, then returned to her side and took her hand while they waited for medical assistance, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear that mirrored her. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness, while the pain intensified and the bleeding continued, and Cordelia felt her hope for this pregnancy, for the child that would have permanently bound her to Sebastian, that would have completed their transformation from hostile strangers to genuine partners, slipping away along with the blood that soaked through towel after towel that the maids brought in increasingly frantic succession. Dr. Whitley arrived within the hour, his examination quick and thorough and utterly devastating in its conclusions. "The baby is in distress," he said grimly, addressing Sebastian rather than Cordelia, as if she were not fully present and capable of hearing his assessment of her own body and child. "Her Grace is experiencing premature labour at approximately 4 months gestation, which gives the child virtually no chance of survival if delivered now. Additionally, the bleeding suggests placental complications that are putting Her Grace herself in considerable danger. If the labour continues unchecked, she may hemorrhage to the point of maternal death." He paused, his expression grave and professionally sympathetic, in the way doctors developed after delivering bad news to countless families over the course of their careers. "I must ask you to make a choice, Your Grace," he continued, his voice steady despite the terrible nature of what he was about to propose. "I can attempt to save the child by allowing the labour to progress naturally, but doing so will almost certainly cost the Duchess her life, given the severity of the bleeding. Or I can intervene to stop the labour and control the hemorrhaging, which will save the Duchess, but will certainly result in the loss of the child, who is too premature to survive, even if somehow delivered alive. You must choose, and you must choose quickly, for delay will result in losing both mother and child." The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute, every person in the room frozen by the horror of the choice being presented, the impossible decision that no husband should ever have to make between his wife and his heir. between the woman he loved and the future of his line. Cordelia tried to speak, tried to tell Sebastian to save the child because that was what duty demanded, what his position required, what any duke would choose when faced with such a decision. The heir always mattered more than the wife, for wives could be replaced, but legitimate heirs born to noble bloodlines were far more valuable than any individual woman's life. But before she could force the words past the pain that made speech nearly impossible, Sebastian spoke with absolute conviction and without any visible hesitation, his voice steady and his eyes holding hers with fierce intensity. "Save my wife," he said, the words emerging with the force of sacred vow. "I chose Cordelia, Dr. Whitley. Do whatever is necessary to stop the bleeding and preserve her life, and to hell with the heir, to hell with the succession, to hell with every expectation and obligation that suggests I should sacrifice the woman I love for the sake of dynastic continuity." He moved closer to the bed, taking her face in his hands with infinite gentleness, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were falling. "I choose you, Cordelia," he repeated, speaking directly to her now, letting her see the absolute truth in his eyes. "I will always choose you. I love you more than titles or heirs or anything else in this world, more than my estates or my name or the entire weight of 6 generations of Ashford legacy. You are what matters. You are what I cannot lose. And if the cost of saving your life is the loss of this child and any possibility of future children, then I accept that cost gladly, without regret, without a moment's hesitation." Cordelia felt her heart break and heal simultaneously at his words, felt every remaining barrier between them shatter under the force of his declaration, the absolute certainty with which he had chosen her life over his dynastic obligations. "Sebastian," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion, "you cannot mean that. You need an heir. The duchy needs—" "I need you," he interrupted fiercely. "The duchy be damned if preserving it costs me you, if maintaining the succession requires your death. I spent 3 months learning what you tried to teach me about power and consequence, and the necessity of valuing people over possessions, and I will not throw away those lessons now by treating you as expendable in favor of abstract dynastic concerns. You are my wife, Cordelia, my partner, the woman who saw me at my worst and still found something worth saving, who loved me enough to force me to become better, even when doing so required being temporarily. How could I possibly choose the heir over you? How could any title or legacy possibly be worth the loss of someone so infinitely precious?" Dr. Whitley cleared his throat, his expression softening slightly at Sebastian's declaration, but his voice remaining professionally brisk. "If those are your orders, Your Grace, I shall proceed immediately to stop the labor and control the bleeding. I must warn you that the process will be difficult and painful for Her Grace, and there is still risk that complications may prove fatal despite intervention. But I will do everything within my power to preserve the Duchess's life as you have requested." He moved to his medical bag, extracting instruments and medicines while issuing crisp orders to the maids about boiling water and fetching additional towels, and Sebastian remained by Cordelia's side throughout the ordeal that followed, holding her hand and murmuring reassurances while the doctor worked to save her life at the cost of the child she had been carrying. The pain was extraordinary, worse than anything she had experienced in her 23 years. But through it all she held on to Sebastian's hand and his words, "I choose you. I will always choose you." And she knew with absolute certainty that their marriage had been transformed in this moment of crisis, from transaction to genuine partnership, from convenient arrangement to real and lasting love. Hours later, when the worst had passed and the bleeding had been controlled and Dr. Whitley had declared her out of immediate danger, though in need of extended rest and recovery, Sebastian collapsed into the chair beside her bed with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs that suggested the full weight of what had nearly happened was finally penetrating his shock. Cordelia reached out with a hand that trembled from exhaustion and touched his hair, drawing his attention back to her with that simple gesture. "The baby?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Dr. Whitley's grim expression, from the emptiness she felt in her body where new life had been growing. "Gone," Sebastian confirmed, his voice breaking on the single word. "Dr. Whitley said the child was lost as soon as the hemorrhaging began, that there was never any real possibility of saving both of you, regardless of which choice I made. But Cordelia, you must understand, even if there had been a chance of saving the heir, Even if the doctor had told me the baby could survive with proper intervention, I would still have chosen you. I would choose you every time, in every circumstance, without hesitation or regret. You are what matters to me. You are what I cannot live without, and I would rather die heirless than live without you beside me. She pulled him closer, ignoring her own exhaustion and pain to comfort him, to reassure him that his choice had been right, and that she loved him for making it, loved him for valuing her life over his dynastic obligations. We will have other children, she whispered, though she knew such promise might be empty given what her body had just endured. And if we do not, if this injury has made me incapable of carrying children to term, then we will face that future together and find meaning in our marriage beyond mere procreation. We have each other, Sebastian, and that is enough. It has to be enough. It is enough, he agreed, pressing his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. You are enough, Cordelia, more than enough to make any life worth living, regardless of whether we have children or estates or anything else society deems essential to aristocratic happiness. I love you, and that love is the only thing I actually need to make our marriage something worth preserving. They lay together in the quiet aftermath of crisis, while the household slowly returned to normal functioning around them, and the sun set beyond the windows, painting the room in shades of gold and amber that softened the edges of everything and made the world seem gentler than it had been during the long hours of pain and fear. Cordelia felt a profound sense of peace settling over her despite the loss of the child she had been carrying, despite the physical pain that would require weeks of recovery, despite the uncertainty about whether she would ever be able to bear children successfully. She had what mattered: a husband who loved her enough to choose her over his obligations, a partnership built on genuine respect and mutual understanding, a marriage that had been tested by crisis and emerged stronger rather than shattered. Recovery took longer than Cordelia had expected, her body requiring nearly 6 weeks to heal sufficiently that she could resume normal activities. But throughout that extended convalescence, Sebastian remained devoted and attentive, transforming from the distant, resentful husband she had married into someone who genuinely cherished her company and sought her opinions on everything from estate management to social correspondence. He read to her during the long afternoons when she was confined to bed rest, brought her meals and medicines with his own hands rather than trusting servants, and spoke to her with a tenderness that suggested he had finally understood what she had been trying to teach him during those harsh months of systematic revenge, that marriage required mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than mere cohabitation and dutiful procreation. 6 months after the crisis that had nearly cost her life, Cordelia received clearance from Dr. Whitley to resume full marital relations, the doctor expressing cautious optimism that she should be capable of carrying future pregnancies to term now that the initial complications had been addressed. The news brought relief to both of them, for while they had adapted to celibacy during her recovery and had found other ways to express physical affection and emotional intimacy, both secretly worried that her injuries might have permanently affected their ability to have children, a concern that carried particular weight given Sebastian's need for an heir, and Cordelia's awareness that failing to produce children might eventually strain even their transformed relationship. The first time they came together after her recovery was different from their wedding night, or any of the subsequent encounters during the early months of their marriage, transformed by everything they had experienced and learned about each other in the intervening months. Sebastian approached her with a tenderness that had been entirely absent during their early couplings, taking his time to ensure her comfort and pleasure, rather than simply completing the act with efficient disregard for her experience. And Cordelia found herself responding with a warmth and openness that her earlier anger and resentment had made impossible, allowing herself to be vulnerable with him in ways she had not trusted during the first months, when she was still punishing him for his contemptuous words and arrogant assumptions. 2 months later, she realized she was pregnant again, the knowledge arriving with a mixture of joy and terror, given what had happened during her previous pregnancy. But Dr. Whitley examined her thoroughly and declared that this pregnancy showed no signs of the complications that had plagued the first, that her body appeared to be responding normally to the demands of carrying a child, that with proper rest and careful monitoring, there was every reason to believe she would carry this baby to term successfully. The months that followed were among the happiest of Cordelia's life, a period of contentment and anticipation during which her relationship with Sebastian continued to deepen and strengthen, their bond forged through crisis and tested by hardship emerging as something genuinely beautiful and enduring. They spent long evenings discussing names and making plans for the nursery, arguing cheerfully about whether they hoped for a boy or girl, Sebastian insisting he would be equally delighted with either, but Cordelia suspecting he secretly wanted a son who could inherit the duchy and end any concerns about succession, while she herself would prefer a daughter who might escape some of the burdens that primogeniture imposed on male heirs. When labour began in the 8th month, right on schedule according to Dr. Whitley's careful calculations, both Sebastian and Cordelia approached it with determination, mixed with the haunting memory of what had happened last time. But the delivery proceeded without significant complications, progressing steadily through the night until Cordelia finally delivered a healthy baby boy as dawn broke over Ashford Manor. The child was small but strong, his lungs working perfectly as evidenced by the lusty cries he produced immediately upon entering the world. And when Dr. Whitley placed him in Cordelia's arms and she looked down at the tiny face that somehow combined features from both herself and Sebastian, she felt such overwhelming love that she could barely breathe through the force of it. "Edward," she said softly, speaking the name they had chosen months earlier, a name that honoured Sebastian's grandfather, who had been by all accounts a good and honourable duke, untainted by the gambling excesses that had characterised more recent generations. "His name is Edward." Sebastian bent over them both, one hand carefully touching his son's head with infinite gentleness, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Edward," he repeated, testing the name, letting it settle into reality. "Our son, our heir, the future of everything we have been building together." Dr. Whitley cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to practical matters. "Both mother and child appear healthy," he announced with professional satisfaction. "Her Grace endured the labour admirably, and young Edward shows every sign of being a strong, viable infant, despite his small size. With proper care and feeding, he should thrive, and I see no reason why Her Grace should not recover fully within the usual period for postpartum convalescence." As the doctor packed his instruments and the midwife bustled about with clean linens and water for bathing the new mother and child, Sebastian remained close, his hand finding Cordelia's and squeezing gently. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for surviving your first pregnancy, despite my terrible choice to make you endure it while you still hated me. Thank you for giving me another chance to be present and supportive during this one. Thank you for bringing our son safely into the world, despite all the risks and fears we both carried about whether history might repeat itself. Thank you for being strong enough to fight for our marriage when I had given you every reason to simply accept the hollow transaction I intended. For teaching me what genuine partnership requires even when doing so demanded temporary cruelty. For loving me enough to force me to become the man you deserved, rather than settling for the diminished version I had become under my father's legacy of failure." Cordelia smiled up at him, exhausted but deeply content, their son cradled safely between them as the morning sun streamed through the chamber windows and illuminated this new beginning they had fought so hard to achieve. "We taught each other," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "You taught me that I was stronger than I believed, capable of wielding power and demanding respect rather than accepting whatever scraps of consideration men chose to offer. And I taught you that strength comes not from dominating others but from building them up, from choosing love over duty when the two conflict, from valuing partnership over possession. We have both become better versions of ourselves through the challenges we faced, Sebastian. And I believe that makes us capable of raising our son to be strong and kind simultaneously, powerful without being cruel, confident without being arrogant." "I love you," he said simply, the words no longer difficult or uncertain, but rather stating an obvious truth that had become the foundation of their shared life. "I love you, Cordelia, more than I imagined possible when we stood in that chapel 6 months ago and spoke vows we both doubted would ever carry genuine meaning. You are my wife, my partner, the mother of my child, and the woman who saved me from becoming my father by refusing to enable my worst impulses and instead demanding I live up to my potential. I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your trust and your love, and I will ensure that our son grows up understanding that his mother is the strongest, wisest, most formidable woman in England, the lady who transformed an arrogant duke into a decent man through sheer force of will and strategic application of consequences. They sat together in the peaceful aftermath of birth while their son slept, and the household gradually woke to the news that the duchy had an heir, that the future of the Ashford line was secured through a child who would grow up knowing he was loved not merely for his position, but for himself, who would learn from both parents the importance of respecting others and valuing character over superficial advantages. And as Cordelia looked down at Edward's tiny face, and then up at Sebastian's transformed expression, she understood that everything they had endured, the hurt and anger, the systematic revenge and eventual forgiveness, the crisis that had nearly destroyed them and instead had forged them into something stronger, had been necessary preparation for this moment, this new beginning, this family they had built from the ruins of a transaction that should have been loveless but had somehow become the foundation for genuine and lasting love.